Hi, I'm Ed Sobey, and we're going to talk about Antarctica today, and specifically about expedition that I was on a few years ago. And we'll also talk a little bit about other expeditions that you can join and places that you might be able to go. So James, if you would pull up the first slide, please. So these are our living accommodations, very different from yours should you do an expedition or a cruise to Antarctica. But these are ours, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later on. But look at the scenery for just a second. One of the things I so dearly love about Antarctica is the stark beauty. The skies aren't that blue in this picture, but the white snow, the red Wanigans, the huts there, everything is huge contrast and absolutely beautiful. So James, the next slide gives a bit of my background. In the upper left, I'm digging a hole through the sea ice in Antarctica in our Wanigan, our hut. I started out life as an oceanographer, and on the top right you can see one of the Oregon State University ships. I did several expeditions with them. In the center, the U.S. naval ship, I was a Navy officer, and we did about 10 expeditions in the Western Pacific. And the bottom left, I teach for Semester at Sea, a wonderful program. And if you've got a college-age student, a child or grandchild, please take a look at Semester at Sea. It's a wonderful experience. And my wife and I sailed on the boat that's on the lower right. We sailed across the Pacific Ocean. We crewed for the captain across. So all in all, I spent a fair amount of my life at sea, whether that's liquid or solid ice. James, the next one shows, I've also directed 5 museums in the United States. The one you more likely to have heard of is the National Inventors Hall of Fame in the center picture. I also founded the National Toy Hall of Fame, and that's a sort of a fun enterprise. But James, moving on. So here is where we're going. And if you're not that familiar with Antarctica, it's a big continent. It's the 4th largest. It's bigger than the United States or bigger than Canada, much, much bigger than Europe, 5 million square miles. So it's a big place and different environments. In the upper left, if you do one of the Viking expeditions to Antarctica, this is where you'll go. Quite a bit warmer, and I think in a lot of ways a lot more scenic. So that area in the circle in the upper left, where I'm taking you in a few minutes, is that circle down in the lower center. That's in the Ross Sea. The Ross Sea, by the way, just became the world's largest marine reserve, about 1.5 million square kilometers. So huge, huge area, which is now off limits for fishing. But we're going there in the winter, and in that circle, you can't see it, but we're going to McMurdo Island in the Ross Sea, McMurdo Sound in the Ross Sea. The next picture, just to give you an idea of the difference in the latitude. In the peninsula in the upper left, where you would go on an expedition ship, it's about 65 degrees south. You might have the opportunity, you probably have the opportunity to cross the Antarctic Circle, which is another degree and a bit. We're going down to 78 degrees south latitude, which is about 700 to 800 miles to the pole. The reason the base was initially set up there by Robert Scott in his first attempt to get to the pole was that's the closest approach you can make to the South Pole. And so he set up there in 1901, and then he revisited the area on his second, the Terra Nova expedition. And Shackleton also used the same area, but not the same huts in his expedition, the Nimrod expedition. Okay, the next slide, please. So in the peninsula area where you would go if you're on one of the cruises down there, you will see a lot of whales. The whales, many of the whales from throughout the Pacific Ocean move to the south in the southern summer, which for us in the northern hemisphere is right now. And they move there because of the rich food. And you can see this humpback whale has come up, its throat is fully extended, it's filled with a couple tons of water and krill, and it needs all that energy because in a few months it will be traveling north again to breed and to calve, and it will eat very little in that path northward. Next slide, please. And of course, beside whales, and I didn't mention all the whales that you'll see, humpbacks, of course, and minke, maybe a blue, maybe a fin and a sai, so a good assortment possibility. You'll also see lots of penguins, and I don't think you can ever see too many penguins, but you'll have your opportunity to see as many as you like. These are kings, and you'll most likely see these on some of the sub-Antarctic islands, maybe not on the peninsula itself. Next slide, please. Charlie Ford, a good friend of mine, provided these slides, and the rest of the slides are ones that I took, and you'll see the quality degrades as you get to my slides. Here's some Adelies, and there's the ice floating about. This is mostly glacial ice, but there's also some sea ice mixed in there. These are Bergy bits and growlers, so anywhere from the size of a large truck to the size of a good sized house floating around in the area. Next slide, please. And in addition to the penguins and the whales, there are 4 species of seals along the Antarctic Peninsula. This is the Weddell seal, and we'll see some on the other side of the continent in just a minute. These animals haul out on the ice. They have very few predators until the ice is removed in the summer, and then they can be preyed upon by the larger seals and also by the orca. So there's Weddell seals, crab-eater seals, which are the most numerous large animal in the world, and the leopard seals and the Antarctic fur seals are all there. So a nice assortment of animals that you'll be able to see. Next slide, please. So this is the area where some of those huge icebergs, the one that's indicated in the right there, B15A, that's roughly the size of Rhode Island. We had one this year that was about the same size that went careening north and was about to slam into the island of South Georgia. And as it grounded itself there, it broke up into some small pieces, but small is relative when you're talking about something that is this huge. So we see these huge flat top icebergs. Now, if you go down there, you will not get anywhere near those, but you'll see the much more manageable hunks of ice, which are very majestic. Next slide, please. I mentioned that the area around Antarctica in summer is so prolific with life, exceptionally rich. And the reason it is it's ice covered in the winter. As the sun rises and provides lots of light for the phytoplankton, the microscopic plants that live in the upper layers, they take off in a huge bloom, and then they're followed by tiny animals that eat them, the zooplankton, and they in turn are food for the krill, the shrimp. You can see a close-up of one of these shrimp. They typically are 1 inch to maybe 3 inches long, and they are there in the bazillions. There are more of them by weight than there are humans on the planet. They're just a tremendous weight of these animals, and everybody eats them, the seals, the whales, the fish, the penguins. So they are what drives the ecology of Antarctica. Next slide, please. And here on the right, you can see a swarm of the krill. And if you're a hungry humpback whale, that is so inviting. You want to come up right under it and just open your mouth wide and try to get as much of that as you possibly can. And of course, the picture on the left, when they come up and there's krill flinging everywhere trying to get away, it's absolutely a great feed for the birds. Next slide, please. So all of this rich ecology, all this rich life in the Antarctic is fueled in part by the circulation of the water. And I mention that because that's what our expedition was all about. The south is on the left and north on the right. And you can see on the left side sea ice. As that ice forms in the winter, the ice is frozen salt water, has about 3% salt to start with, but as it freezes, that salinity decreases and that salt drops down into the water, making very, very dense and very, very cold water, the densest water in the ocean. So that water sinks to the bottom of the ocean and has to be replaced. The water that replaces it brings up nutrients, and as the sun comes back up in the spring and provides the energy for photosynthesis, life takes off, and in a very, very rich profusion. So our expedition was to go down to an area and look to see if we could actually see this happening. We know it happens, but no one's actually been there to see it happen. And so that's what we were trying to do. Next slide, please. So here I mentioned that the sea ice grows in the winter. On the left, that's the highest extent of sea ice. So it about doubles the land area of the continent. So you see the continent at about 5.5 million square miles. Then there's another 5 million square miles of frozen salt water. In the summer, that all melts, or it breaks up, and the ice moves northward and eventually melts. And so on the summer minimum, you get just a little bit of sea ice. So you have this enormous heat engine, if you will, that expands and contracts seasonally. In the winter, there's very little or no sunlight. Whatever sunlight there is reflected off the surface, so there's no heating of the water. In the summer, you've got that dark water which absorbs the sunlight as the sun is up for either 24 hours or 18 to 20 hours, depending on where you are. So we had this enormous difference caused by the freezing of the salt water. Next slide, please. So here's another look. The peninsula is there on the left. We're going to that small rectangle in the Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf, and let's have the next slide. So here we are in McMurdo Sound, Ross Island. You can see the peninsula both in the map on the left and on the satellite photo on the right. That peninsula, it's sticking out due south. It's about 3.5 kilometers wide and about 20 kilometers long. This comes off Ross Island, which is formed by 4 volcanoes. The 2 better known ones are Erebus and Terror, that Ross named after his ships, the Erebus and Terror, in the 1840s. He was the first person to come down here. We'll see a couple more shots of Mount Erebus. It is it's the second highest active volcano in Antarctica. Next slide, please. So here's a close-up. If you look closely, you'll see that I've inverted this image. So north is to the upside of the image. McMurdo Station, which is the largest U.S. research base, is there on the left. Scott Base is the New Zealand base. They're only separated by a couple miles. Off to the right is the ice shelf. So this is glacial ice. This is not frozen salt water. The continent has been inundated with snow. It compacts to ice and glaciers. for thousands of years, actually about 35 million years. That ice is pushed out to sea, and that's what is over on the ice shelf. On the left, to the left of that peninsula, is frozen salt water. So we are right at the junction of the glacial ice and the sea ice. Next slide, please. This is the National Science Foundation headquarters. They fund most of the research, the U.S. research in Antarctica, and there are the flags of the member nations, the signers of the Antarctic Treaty. So no one can have military there, no one can extract resources there, no one can claim the territory if they're a signature of the Antarctic Treaty. Behind the building, you see Observation Hill, and in the next slide, we'll look down from the top of that hill and look at the base, James. So there's from the top of Ob Hill, and you can see the base, which is operated mostly by the U.S. Navy and some civilian contractors, and that's where we got our equipment and our sheds, and then from there, we went out onto the ice that you see on the upper left side. Next slide, please. So there's Mount Erebus, the largest mountain. It wasn't until Shackleton's expedition, the Nimrod, that somebody got to the top of it. Here it is erupting. It's erupting almost all the time, and there's a little bit of a steam cloud coming out of the top of Mount Erebus. At this point, we're about 25 miles away. Next slide, please, James. So we got there by hitching a ride in C-130. The Navy has a special Antarctic detachment. If you look, you can see a couple interesting things. One is the propellers haven't stopped. Now, typically, if you're in a propeller plane, they stop the propellers long before you get off. But here the pilots did not want to stop because at these temperatures, here was about minus 40 or minus 45 degrees, the fluids used in the engines can start to congeal. And if that happened and they couldn't start the plane, the pilot is stuck with the airplane until they get some serious help. So the pilots keep the engines running. The other thing you notice is the wheels have been covered with skis. So we took the plane from California to Hawaii, about 8 hours, from Hawaii to Pago Pago, about 8 hours, and from Pago Pago to Christchurch, about 8 hours. And we were in Christchurch for a couple days to pick up equipment and to do some briefings there. And then another 8 hours from Christchurch to the Antarctic. And in Christchurch, they put on the skis so we could land on the ice. So they don't have a land area large enough to use as an airport, so they land on the ice, the glacial ice. Next slide, please. Here is our team. There are 4 of us. Henry, who is at the time was a research scientist with the School of Oceanography at Oregon State. I'm on the right. In the center behind Henry is Rocky, who is our electronics technician. And on the left is Marilyn Gwynn. As far as we know, there were 2 women on the continent. If you can imagine that, an entire continent with 2 women. One was a nun who was based at McMurdo Station. The other was Maryland. And so Maryland was clearly the most popular person on the continent. And what Maryland needed or Maryland wanted, there were a dozen guys who would do darn near anything to get it for, including the toilet seat that Henry is holding. We encouraged Maryland after a couple days. When we got there, we're trying to figure out procedures, and one of the procedures is how do you attend to bodily functions when you're out in the middle of nowhere. And the procedure called for resting one's delicate features on top of that plastic toilet before it was fur lined, and at 40 below, when the skin meets that plastic, it's not a pleasant experience. So Marilyn called up to the base on the radio and said, "Guys, my bottom is getting cold on this toilet seat," and we had solutions to that problem in a big hurry. Next slide, please. So here are two huts, our Wanigans, that have been dragged out onto the sea ice. This ice is about 6 feet thick, and on top of that, you can see the snow that's blown up there, the sastrugi, the rigid snow, and behind us you can see Mount Erebus is erupting. Here is the stark beauty of the continent. Some of the mountains are not snow covered, some of them stick up through the snow, and so they're black, and that shines such a big contrast. And on a sky blue day with that white everywhere, just fantastic view. Next slide, please. So here's how the huts got out there. They took a couple of these large vehicles, Nodwells, track vehicles, and they towed us out onto the ice 10 to 15 miles from McMurdo Base, and then they went away and we set up our camp. Next slide. In determining where we were going to go, there were a couple things we had to make sure. One is that we, in fact, were on sea ice and not on freshwater ice or glacial ice. So we would use the augers and taste the residue of the ice coming up to see if it had salt. Frozen salt water retains a little bit of the salt, and the glacial ice, of course, is entirely salt-free. The other thing is we didn't want to be in a place where we had to dig through 8, 9, 10 or more feet of ice. We wanted a reasonable spot. We were looking for about 6 feet, and so we were testing the ice for its thickness and its salinity. And once we found the right spot, then we could locate the huts there. Next slide, please. So here we are again using the auger, and you can see this is a pretty cold day because although the guys are working hard, nobody has taken off any of the clothing. So this is about 45 or 50 below. Next slide, please. So there's our two Wanigans. Number 7 is where we did our research and cooked our meals. Number 4 is where we slept. And you can see some barrels there of kerosene. Each of those two Wanigans had its own kerosene heater, and off to the left is our electric generator, which we had to keep going. First couple nights in that number 4 Wanigan, Marilyn and I were in the upper bunks, and Henry and Rocky were in the lower bunks, and we played temperature tag all night long, where up in the upper blanks where I was, it would be about 90 or 95 degrees. And so I'd crawl out of bed and jump down to the deck and turn down the heater. And on the deck itself was well below freezing. And so where Henry and Rocky were was typically 30 or 35 degrees. And so no sooner was I back up in my bunk when one of them would hop up and turn up the heater. And until we got a fan requisition from base, we played this tag of the thermostat all night long. Next slide, please. You can see that between the two Wanigans, we had a rope and we even had a post. And the reason for that is whiteout conditions like this. People have been lost even going short distances. They know exactly where they're going, but in whiteout conditions, they get disoriented. By the way, you won't see this or you won't experience this if you go on a cruise to the Antarctic Peninsula. But here they were fairly common, and so we had guide ropes. And in a whiteout, you'd go outside, you'd open the door, grab the rope, and then you'd walk with the rope to the next Wanigan. Next slide, please. Here's our transportation, not the huge tracked vehicles, a little guy that could carry the 4 of us. Kind of fun to drive, except that this one always steered in one direction, which means that you're constantly pulling on the brake on the other side to correct it, to get it to go straight. But nice to have it, so when we had to go into town for supplies or our weekly shower, we could hop in the vehicle and off we go. Of course, if you live in the northern climates, you know that this thing has to be plugged in. It has a heater inside and has to be plugged in all the time, or the fluids inside would freeze and we would be left without transportation. Next slide, please. One of our biggest fears was a tidal crack. If a tidal crack occurred between us and McMurdo Station, we could, with some southerly winds, be blown to the north, and they had no way of getting us, and we had no way of getting back until the springtime when an icebreaker would come in and fetch us. So we paid a lot of attention to the cracking sound of the ice, and we'll hear some ice sounds in a few minutes, but that was one constant worry. Next slide, please. One of our neighbors, our Kiwi neighbors, was doing some research, and they at the time were getting around with dog sleds. So they would use Weddell seals to feed the dogs, and therefore didn't have to import as much oil, which was a very big plus, but they have stopped doing that now, and no more dog sleds in Antarctica. Next slide, please. So here we are. Our job, once we're on location, was to make a hole in the ice and get to water. We're oceanographers. We have to get to some water. So we first had the brainstorm of using a Herman Nelson heater used for warming up jet engines of airplanes. We thought we would melt our way through 6 feet of ice. And so we had the vise there in the upper left, and we piped the hot air into our Wanigan, and there's Rocky in the center. He's got the hot air blowing down on the ice, and he's trying to pump out the melt water and pump it out of the Wanigan. Well, we left that there, and pretty soon the inside of the hut got up to about 150 degrees. Outside it was 50 below. So Rocky and I joined the 200 Club, which is running naked with a 200-degree temperature difference. So we accomplished that, but we did it the easy way, where we started out at about 150 degrees. Anyway, even though we gained admittance to that austere, highly esteemed club, we didn't melt more than a half an inch of ice. So we had to go back to the old way of doing it, which was with a chainsaw. Next slide, please. So here's Henry getting a start. You can see that the Wanigan has a hole in the floor so we can get on the ice. Henry is standing on the top of the ice. It's about 6 feet thick. He's using an electric chainsaw. And thinking this through, we had a lot of difficulty figuring out all the issues that might arise, one of which being electric chainsaw hitting water that has a high salt content. But here's Henry making the first cuts. Would cut the ice into 9 chunks, and then next slide, please. As we went down, here I am a couple feet down using a crowbar to break out those chunks of ice. We had to move about 1.5 tons of ice out of that to get to the water underneath. Next slide, please. We did try an alternative method, and that's this huge auger, and we set that in there with all sorts of weights, and we let it grind and grind and grind, and nothing happened. So we went back and had to finish the job with the chainsaw. Next slide, please. Here's the auger going round and round with a big hunk of lead on top of it, but it just was not able to get a good purchase on the ice and dig it out. Next slide, please. Here, I'm standing in the hole. I'm, almost 5 feet down. You can see light is coming. The sunlight at this point, probably about noon, was coming through the ice and gives this very beautiful blue view there. You can also see that we've got a rope with knots tied in it. That was our safety line. If you broke through and water's rushing up, you had a quick way of getting out of the hole. On the left is the picture. This is a couple hours before actual breakthrough. So we're down quite a ways, but not quite far enough. Next slide, please. Later, we did this method several different sites, and eventually the Navy took some pity on us, and they developed a better system with this huge auger on the back of one of the monster tracked vehicles, and that could punch through 6 feet of ice in no time and solved our problem of digging the ice hole. Next slide, please. So life inside the Wanigan, Rocky and Maryland on the left are cooking on a Coleman stove, much as you might do if you're out of the caravan park, camping someplace. And on the right, we're eating. There's our radio is just in front of me. It didn't work very often, which wasn't comforting, but we didn't really have much need to talk to the guys on base. Right in front of Maryland, you see a large shiny object. That's our heater, and that's where we got our fresh water. Next slide, please. So every morning, one of us would have to go to the ice hole and clean out the slush, the ice that had formed overnight, get that out of the Wanigan. And then the other early morning task, and next slide, please, is Maryland going out to get some fresh snow. And so we'd take this in and put it on top of the heater and just let it melt all day long. And as soon as it had all melted, we'd go out and get some more snow. The most famous warning in polar travel is don't eat yellow snow. And so some rigor is required to keep different functions separated. And so one side of the Wanigan was reserved for getting snow, and the other side was open for doing whatever. Next slide, please. Here we've got the hole open, and now we have access to the water. So I'm doing what oceanographers have done for 100 years. I'm putting a Nansen bottle onto this wire. Nansen, if you sailed with Viking, if you're Norwegian, you certainly know Nansen, a very famous man, a real hero. He invented this bottle in addition to doing many other things. You'll see his ship, a model of his ship, on the Viking ships up in the Explorer's Lounge. So I'm putting the bottle on, I'm tightening it down. When we get about 10 of these bottles separated from the surface down to the bottom, I'll add a weight that falls down and trips these, capturing water inside the bottle, flipping upside down to lock the thermometer in place, and then we'll pull them back up and get the sample of water to measure salinity and read the thermometer to know the temperature. So we can do that throughout the water column. Next slide, please. Our other instrumentation, we're also doing water samples to filter them for marine life, and we were measuring currents. And here's Rocky yet again trying to fix our current meter. Next slide, please. The current meter sat in this device, and we could squeeze it down through the ice hole vertically, and then it would drop down into a horizontal position and slowly sink to the bottom, which is about 500 meters, and it would record the current all the way down, and then would pull it back up out through the ice hole with that winch on the right. Next slide, please. Here we are on moving day. We would work a site for 5 to 7 days. We'd call the base, they'd send out some vehicles, and they would tow us to the next location, and then would start over again. Next slide, please. There we are. There's one of the vehicles tracking us across the sea ice. Next slide, please. We had neighbors. We couldn't see them from our location, but 3, 4, 5 miles away was a group, 2 guys from University of Colorado who were studying aerosols. They had some way of collecting aerosols, and they'd send up a balloon every day and get more data that way. So because they were relatively close to us, we hung out. They come over for dinner once in a while, and we'd go over to their place once in a while. And nice to talk to other people and not just the same group of 4. Next slide, please. There was very, very limited marine life there. This is the only penguin we saw, again, to differentiate from the Antarctic Peninsula, where you'll see thousands and tens of thousands of them. Here, this is the lone emperor penguin. This guy somehow got turned around. He was headed in the wrong direction. He probably was not going to survive because he was heading away from the ocean rather than towards the ocean, the open ocean. But he was a well-photographed penguin as he hung around Arwanigan for an hour or so and then took off. Next slide, please. Here's the Weddell seal. I showed one earlier in the peninsula. These animals are able to open, they unhinge their jaw and they can chew through the ice if they have to. They typically go to where the ice is broken and dig a hole, and that's their breathing hole. And they can dive deep and they can stay down a long time, catching fish and crab and other things there. And on a sunny day, they would pop out of the hole and lay on the ice and warm up a little bit. Next slide, please. Here's the, James is playing the sound. I hope you can hear that. It's a little bit faint. When they're underwater, they use acoustics to navigate and to communicate. Next slide, please. Here is one on the left coming up. You can see that our ice hole has frozen over. We spent the preceding night in town, getting our shower and having a drink at the bar and watching a movie or two, and then came back out. And by morning, the hole was well frozen over. And as Henry is starting to dig through it, one of the Weddell seals decides to use it as a breathing hole. And as cute and attractive as the animals are, their oral hygiene is not good, and a rather disgusting smell that Henry's encountering there. On the right is another one who pops up and just checked us out. They didn't use the hole too often, our ice hole too often, as a breathing hole, but occasionally just got curious to see what the light was and see what the commotion was. Next slide, please. Here are some of the sea ice features, a tidal crack on the left, and as tides rose and fell on the ocean, other parts of ice were held fast to the land, and so they would break. And it was kind of interesting to look inside those cracks, and you could see the hoar frost, the hoar ice inside, and kind of pretty. On the right is sastrugi, or the frozen snow that dots the surface. Not the easiest thing to walk on. It's not like a smooth billiard table. You're breaking through and you're running into these clumps of sastrugi. So not really easy to make your way by foot. Next slide, please. I hope you were able to hear the cracking of the ice there. Not a real rifle shot that signifies a big crack, but nonetheless some of the ice grinding against each other, and something that gave us alert to jump outside and see what was going on. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that as the ice forms, it drops the salt content out of the ice, and it does it by forming these tubes, these brine channels and tubes that are avenues for the very, very salty water, very, very cold water to come out of the bottom of the ice. And when it hits the bottom, as it is on the slide on the right, it instantly freezes on the bottom and kills anything that's there. So the underside of the ice is not a flat plane at all. It's got this very rich structure to it. Next slide, please. Some of the other researchers there, this fellow was doing work on the one in the center with the scuba was doing benthic ecology. The other fellow was working on the antifreeze properties of Antarctic cod or Antarctic toothfish, very similar to Patagonia toothfish. And of course, he would draw the blood samples, and then we helped him eat a couple of these. But he had been going down for 8 or 9 years. He had a long history of work there. Next slide, please. I mentioned that the Kiwis were doing, the New Zealanders, excuse me, were doing research there. This fellow, an engineer, was working on a heat engine that used the differential temperature from about 40 below up in the air to 2 below in the water beneath. So that huge temperature difference is enough to drive an engine, and he was trying to create the engine that could be powered by this heat differential. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we were at the same location that Scott used for his first expedition, the Discovery Expedition in 1901. This is his hut, and we got permission to go inside, and I apologize for the photos, but there's zero light inside that hut. And some of the supplies, these are actually supplies from 1910. Next slide, please. But it's kind of inspiring to be the same place that that Scott and Shackleton and Bowers and all the really great Antarctic explorers, many of the great Antarctic explorers, Mawson was here. So just fun to be in this structure. Next slide, please. Not well maintained at the time. I think it's been improved now, and it is a historic site. And luckily, you can't take anything from there, and you can't get in there without permission. So it will hopefully be there for a long time. Next slide, please. So we were there. I saw one of the questions somebody asked, how long were you there? We were there about 7 or 8 weeks. This is our flying out on a C-141 the Navy provided. And you can see this glacier coming down, and it's about to form a decent size iceberg. Will be maybe a mile or mile and a half wide and a mile or 2 miles long. So not a giant one, but a nice flat top, typical Antarctic iceberg. So that was one of our last views of the continent as we flew back to Christchurch. And next slide, please. Of course, I have to include a sunset. The sunsets in Antarctica are breathtaking. They go on forever. You know, if you're in the tropics, the sun, when it sets, it's down and it's dark right away. In the polar zone, you can sit there and take sunset photos for an hour as the sun slowly creeps lower and lower. So we bid adieu to Antarctica. Next slide, please. So some of my adventures from Antarctica are in my newest book, Shipwrecked Treasures, Ink and Gold and Living on Ice, a celebration of 50 years. My beard last month became 50 years old. Anyway, 50 years of adventure in the book, and if you're going on a cruise, you might enjoy one of my other books, The Field Guide to Ocean Voyaging, how to identify everything you see from the deck of a Viking ship. So those are there, and I want to thank you all for tuning in. I'm going to look at the questions here and answer as many as I can, and the ones I don't get to, I will endeavor to, I think I can get your email and reply to you in a day or so, but let's look back to the questions. And see, Susan in Niagara Falls asked, what's the best advice for clients about what you should pack? The Viking gave a presentation, I think it was on Wednesday. Their site has good information on what they provide, and I believe what they provide is a parka and pants. They may provide boots. You need layers because the temperature there could be quite different. You're not going to see 40 below. I'm relatively sure. You're going there in the summer, the Antarctic summer, and you're quite a bit farther north. So temperatures of maybe 35, 40 degrees plus down to a little below freezing. So a few layered items. Certainly don't overpack. Don't take everything you have. You won't have room in the cabin for everything. And you won't be able to move if you have it all on. So a good assortment allowing you to adapt to the conditions. Bob in Fresno. Now, I haven't talked to Bob in Fresno in a long, more than 20 years. He asked, how does exploring Antarctica compare to a 50-mile backpack trip over the Sierras? And the two experiences, Bob, are very different. Bob and I shared several backpacking trips in the Sierra Mountains, and very different experiences, both wonderful experiences. And thanks for reminding me of that. Michael in the United States, what medical facilities exist on the continent? There is at McMurdo Station a fairly decent setup, and I don't know how many doctors are there, but more than one, I'm pretty sure. South Pole is interesting for the winter over. There's one doctor, and there was a big story 10 years ago about the doctor needing surgery, and there was no way they could get to her. Unusual to have a woman doctor, and unusual for the doctor to be the patient, and had to do things pretty remotely. But there is a lot of concern and a lot of preparation for medical issues. How long did you stay there? We were there about 7 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. That's from James in the UK. Maria asks, can you explain why there are no polar bears in Antarctica? And I can't remember when polar bears became a separate species, but the continent itself has only been separated from South America by about 40 million years. So in 40 million years, if you weren't on that hunk of land, and you were a land animal, you had great difficulty getting there. And of course, now the land surface is covered by up to 2 miles of ice, and there's nothing there to eat. So even if there were some animals that were left there when the Antarctic separated from South America, they have long since died. I don't know what fossils are there. We know used to be many million years ago a warm and humid place. So probably a ton of fossils are there. Favorite time of day? Corey in Charleston asked any time of day. What's striking most to me is getting up in the morning and opening the door and stepping outside at 40 below and taking that first breath, and it goes, wow, I'm not in Kansas. This is really magnificent. Everything is so stark and clean. Well, how has your world view changed from your first scientific expedition? Enormously. My first expeditions on ships, the Antarctic expedition, changed in a lot of ways who I am and how I looked at the world, and a very profound way for me. And opened up so many more experiences for me that I totally did not anticipate. Really profound changes. For a first polar visit, would you do the Arctic or the Antarctic? Let me be very clear about this. I would say yes. Both are wonderful. Both are very different. I would look at the ship. You don't want somebody going down in some mega cruise ship. They're not prepared. They're not going to stop at the islands. You won't have the time to get off. You want to look at the itinerary and your budget and where they're going. And they're both unique. I think the Antarctic is a little bit more unique. No sound. I'm sorry we didn't get the sound, Phil. Anne in Morristown, are you concerned about the ice shelves that have broken off? How dangerous is the one that is approaching South Georgia? For human life, it's not particularly dangerous because we know where the things are. We've got good satellite coverage and everybody can avoid them, and you do want to stay away. So it's not a concern for human life. It can be a huge concern for penguins and seals. There was some concern that they would be trapped on South Georgia and they would be unable to get past this iceberg out to places where they could feed. And I'm a few days behind. I'm not sure if that's really an issue. I think it's broken up enough, so it's not an issue. How thick is the ice at South Pole? I think the ice is about 2 miles thick there, maybe just a little under. So it's a big hunk of ice. Stephanie, thank you. Great info. Thank you, Dr. Sobey. Can discuss highlights of the difference between, between the Arctic and the Antarctic. One's an ocean that's covered with ice in the winter. The other is a continent, which is covered by ice all the time, and in winter is surrounded by ice. So the two are vastly different. The only thing they share really is that they both get cold and they both have limited sunshine. Both are magnificent places to be. The Antarctic is a little tougher to get there, a little more expensive, provides a little more unique experience, but I recommend both. How's that for not giving you an answer? Richard in Cambridge says, is there a human presence on Antarctica all year round? Yes, there are, let me hazard a guess, 20, 25 bases. The Russians, I think, still have a couple. Theirs is the coldest spot on Earth, or one of the coldest spots on Earth. We have our big base at McMurdo. We also have Palmer Peninsula that you might get to stop in and see, and South Pole Base. And we might have a couple others. The Chileans have one. In fact, they just were infected by COVID and had to evacuate. Argentinians, the Brits, the Poles, France, Kiwis, of course, and the Australians all have stations. How does the plane take off with skis? Just like it would with wheels. Probably a little bit more friction there, a little more rubbing. They do go out and prepare the surface. They've got road graders there trying to smooth out that strugi so it's a smoother and easier to get off. That was Ann in the United States. So Ann asked, what are the solutions to the toilet seat issue? We got smart, and it's one of those things that necessity is the mother of invention. When you're sitting there on 40 below plastic, your brain starts to work pretty effectively. And so we figured out that with a little bit of coordination, we could keep the toilet seat inside where it was warm and fur-lined and not have to have it at 40 below when it was time to use it. So it just took some innovation. For our party, of course, at the time was the only one in the Antarctic with a woman, so we had a little bit more issue, but really it worked out pretty easily. Please explain why dog teams are used no longer. So and how to use human waste. All that, the waste has to be taken into base and kept and then hauled out in a ship. The ships come in every year and drop off supplies and have to take out all the waste. The dogs are no longer used because the Kiwis are the only ones doing it, and New Zealanders took issue with killing of the Weddell seals to feed the dogs, and so they stopped doing that. Richard, Lady Lake, United States. What year were you there? 1974. Oh, Richard wintered over at Bird Station for deep freeze. Now, deep freeze, we had Operation High Jump, which was IGY, International Geophysical Year, 1957-58, and then deep freeze started, I think, around 60, and Richard was there in 70, deep freeze 70, October of 69. He was there for a full year. Well, good on you, Richard. I'm sure that was a crazy, wonderful experience. Marianne Clearwater, curious as to why they gave up. Okay. Lauren, hi Ed. Why don't they use dogs? I think we talked about that. Have you seen signs of global warming, climate change in your work? Yeah, there are signs of global warming both in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And my specialty and what I worked on was sea ice in the Arctic. Of course, that's well documented. It doesn't, excuse me, doesn't extend nearly as far each year, and the ice is thinner, much thinner. In the Antarctic, up to this point, we haven't seen the extent decreasing, or we haven't seen it decreasing very much, but we've seen the thickness. So ice grows about 1 to 2 meters in a year. If it doesn't melt or get ripped away, it can continue growing the next winter. And what we're seeing in both the Arctic and the Antarctic is much thinner ice, will be easier to break up, and in the Arctic especially, a huge change in the size of the ice distribution. I imagine Benjamin in the US asked, I imagine stargazing would be spectacular. Unbelievable. The air is crystal clear, no, aside from the smoke that we generate, which is minuscule, nothing in the air. And if it's cloudless, it's just, you're sucking in that cold air and has your undivided attention, and the sky is brilliant. We did see aurora. I think when we first got there, I think there was a couple nights we saw aurora. Why are South Georgia, Falklands, or Argentina used as jumping off points? It depends on your nationality. If you're British, you're using Falklands probably, or Chile. Other countries are using Argentina just for the political issues, and that's where you can get a ship. That's where you can get a supply ship. You don't want to leave from New Zealand. It's a long, long way. Barry in Sarasota asked, what are the conclusions of our research? Any surprises? The conclusion we came to was, can teams operating by themselves in the Antarctic winter collect the oceanographic data we need to see this overturning of the world's ocean? And the answer, I think we showed, was yes, but you have to have the guts to leave somebody out on the ice knowing that you may not pick them up for 6 months. And no one to this point has had the guts to do that. What impact has the Antarctic Treaty affected the continent? The treaty is terribly important, and there are mineral resources, biologic resources that would be imperiled without the Antarctic Treaty. People are starting to eat those krill that I showed you, those small shrimp-like animals, and they're eating, not a few here and a few there, but they're getting them by the tons, so it's impacting the environment. The continent is covered with coal. It could be mined. So that treaty is very important. What major mysteries are related to the continent? I think there's probably a ton. We still haven't figured out all the aspects of the climate issue. We haven't figured out all the issues with the geology. Everything there is just a little bit more difficult to resolve. The logistics are twice as hard as someplace else. It takes a lot longer to get there. You're in environmental stress all the time. So things are just harder to do and takes longer to get them resolved. So I think there's a lot of issues. Have we gotten to all the questions? Wow. I think we've gotten to them all. Cool. Well, it's just about an hour, and I'm sure you have something else to do with your life besides listening to me. So I thank you again for tuning in, and I really hope you will get to see the Antarctic, and I hope I'll be able to join you on a ship there, and we'll see you on the deck of a Viking ship looking out over the wondrous ocean and maybe Antarctica. Thanks very much.